For centuries, the story of creation in Genesis has felt like one of those things you either take on faith or you see it as being in complete opposition to science. But what if that's a false choice? What if the original Hebrew text is hiding something, a kind of code that, when you finally unlock it, shows a story that doesn't just tolerate science, but actually runs parallel to it in some really surprising ways? So, let's do this. We're going to walk through a completely new reading of Genesis, looking at it not as a story of 6 24-hour days, but as a blueprint for the entire cosmos.
Everything, and I mean everything in this analysis, hangs on this one single word change. My whole argument is that the Hebrew verb bara'a, which we've always been told means create, is actually much better translated as to design or to plan. Now, this isn't just me playing with words. This one change reframes the entire narrative. It shifts from an act of magic, poof, things appear from nothing, to an act of incredible engineering, the execution of a grand design.
And here's why that's so important. If Genesis 1:1 is God designing the universe, then everything that comes after is the step-by-step execution of that design. This immediately solves some of the weird-seeming redundancies in the text, like why it says the heavens and earth were made in verse 1, and then they seem to be made all over again later. It's not a mistake, it's a logical flow. First you make the plan, then you start the construction.
Okay, so to really see this new picture, we need two keys to unlock the text. One is about the language, and the other is about the structure of the story itself. These are the tools we're going to use to decode this ancient script. So key number one is our verb bara. When you look at how this word is used throughout the rest of the Bible, interpreting it as design is just remarkably consistent. It clears up all the confusion. When the text says God designed and then made something, it's not just repeating itself, it's describing two totally different stages, the blueprint and then the build. I found that this translation works in pretty much every single instance the word appears. The second key is all about structure. You see, Genesis 2:4 flat out tells us what we're reading. It calls this account a toledah, which means generations or descendants. This is huge. It tells us we're not reading a diary of 7 literal days. We're reading a genealogy. And what do we know about genealogies or family trees? Well, things can overlap. Events can be grouped by theme. They aren't always in a perfectly straight chronological line. This gives us the freedom to look at the sequence of events in a whole new way. All right, with these two keys in hand, the 6 days of creation suddenly look a lot more like 6 eras of cosmic history. So let's go through them one by one and see just how closely this new reading lines up with what scientists now know about the history of our universe.
So, Era 1. It kicks off with the universe being formless and empty. Now, how would you describe a void of pure, intangible potential to an ancient audience? Well, the best metaphor you have is a huge, dark, deep ocean at night. The text then says, God's Spirit hovered over the waters. I think this is describing an external influence on the quantum state of the pre-universe, basically imprinting that initial design just before the Big Bang.
And what's the very first formative act? Let there be light. This aligns perfectly with what physicists call the photon epoch. It's the moment the universe, which was just this dark, dense soup of particles, suddenly became transparent and was just flooded with light. In fact, what we now call the cosmic microwave background, that's the afterglow of this exact event. It's the earliest photograph of the universe we could ever possibly take. Now get this, because this is one of the most interesting parts. That famous line, and there was evening and there was morning. My analysis of the Hebrew root words points to a totally different meaning. And there was mixing and there was seeking. See? It's not about a 24-hour day. It's about a process. Mixing is the chaos, the undifferentiated soup of stuff. And seeking is the process of ordering, of things finding their place. It's a perfect description of order emerging from chaos. Okay, on to Era 2. This is where God creates the expanse, or rakia. For thousands of years, people pictured this as a solid dome over the earth. But the root verb for rakia actually means to hammer or stretch something out really thin. And that is a brilliant, almost poetic description of what actually happened. As matter started clumping together because of gravity, the space between it was literally stretched thin, forming the vacuum of space. So if you were to zoom in on our own little neighborhood, what would this look like? Well, from an Earth-centric point of view, this era describes our planet forming inside this thick, swirling cloud of dust and gas, the accretion disk. So when the text talks about separating the waters from the waters, it's describing the forming planet, the waters below, from the rest of the solar nebula, the waters above. And there's our refrain again, ending the second era. It's not marking a sunset, it's marking the end of another major phase of organization, The chaos of that early nebula was giving way to the order of a solar system. It was a period of mixing, followed by a period of seeking.
All right, just a quick heads up. As we go into the next few eras, I'm going to talk about them in a slightly different order than they appear in the text. And remember why we can do that? Because we're reading a genealogy, not a strict timeline. These eras are grouped more by category, and they can even overlap. The whole narrative is focused on what matters to humanity from an Earth-based view, so the order is all about what an observer on the ground would have noticed first. So, with that in mind, let's jump ahead to Era 4. This is when the sun properly ignites and becomes a star. The solar wind it creates is so powerful, it literally blows away all the dust and gas that have been shrouding the early Earth. So, from the surface of our planet, this is the moment the sky would finally clear and you could see the great lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars for the very first time. It makes perfect sense why they appear in the text after the Earth is already formed. Okay, now let's pop back to Era 3. After the planet's chaotic formation, its surface finally begins to cool down. All that water vapor in the thick, steamy atmosphere starts to rain down, gathering into seas and letting dry land appear for the first time. This is the moment our world starts to look like the world we know, with oceans and continents. So the stage is now set. The planet is ready. And this is when life appears. And you'll see here that the text gets incredibly deliberate and specific with its language, and that distinction is key to everything that follows. So here, we can actually map the events of these later eras onto our own geological record. You have the first land plants appearing back in the Devonian period. Then, the rise of what the text calls winged flying creatures, which in the Carboniferous period would have been these giant insects. Much later, you get the grazing mammals. And finally, anatomically modern humans. The sequence described in Genesis is, well, it's pretty darn close. But here is the most critical distinction in the whole text. The book says that plants and land animals were produced by the Earth. They just happened, almost like they were an emergent property of the system that was already in place. But for the teeming creatures of the sea, for the flying creatures, and then again for mankind, the text brings back our special verb, bara. God designed them. For me, this points to very specific moments of direct divine input, maybe to introduce the breathtaking complexity of animal life, or that mysterious spark of human consciousness. So after these 6 eras of formation and design, the text says the work is finished. And that brings us to the final 7th era, the Age of Rest, which is completely different from all the others.
This entire process seems to be governed by a principle I call fieri ex potentia, or becoming from potential. The idea is basically that God creates the initial design and sets up the laws of physics, and then allows for incredible complexity to emerge naturally from that potential. He works with the universe he designed. He doesn't have to constantly break its rules.
Now here's the kicker. The 7th era, the Sabbath, is the only one that doesn't end with that mixing and seeking refrain. Why? Because the work of physical creation is done. The era isn't over. My contention is that we are living in God's Sabbath right now. This is an age where God is no longer building new physical things, but is instead interacting with the creation he already completed.
And if we are living in this age of divine rest, then the whole purpose of existence kind of shifts, right? It's not about physical formation anymore. It's about relationship. Just like this passage from Deuteronomy suggests, the focus moves to the dynamic between us, humanity, and the Creator. And inside this incredible finished creation, humanity was given this really unique and specific job. We weren't just another creature. We were given a directive to fill the earth and to subdue it, to have dominion.
And that really brings us to the final question we have to ask ourselves. If we are living in an age where God's physical creative work is finished, an age of divine rest, what on earth does that directive to subdue the earth actually mean for us today? Is it about domination and exploitation? Or is it about stewardship, about understanding, and maybe about helping to complete the amazing potential that was baked into the design from the very beginning? The text gives us the blueprint. What we do with it now is up to us.